There are a couple of things I want to talk about that I didn't get into that module, and one of them is this concept of a trophic cascade. I think there are a couple of things that I really think the Park Service should be proud of themselves. One is closing the dumps to bears back in the 70s, and then sticking with that because that was a difficult decision to make. And the general ethic of trying to return the ecosystem to a natural ecosystem, managing as a wilderness rather than just as a true national park. And then, and as part of that, then also the reintroduction of the wolf. That was really a critical thing in reestablishing a naturally controlled ecosystem, a naturally managed ecosystem. So what I want to look at is the consequence, and I've talked about individually some of the consequences of this, but reintroduction of the wolf led to a lot of changes in the food web. And so when we see an addition or removal of a species and the consequential effects of that, we call that a trophic cascade. So I would like you to look at, in summary now, the trophic cascade that resulted from the introduction to the wolf. So some of this was anticipated and some was not. And so in reintroduction of the wolf, it's kind of immediate value, or one of the things that we noticed was that coyote populations crashed. That was not anticipated. And what I have in red here, the coyote is in red, that's telling us it would be a negative effect, and what I have in green will be a positive effect. So anyway, we didn't realize that wolves hate coyotes and kill coyotes, but they do, and so the coyote population crashed. Anyway, we also didn't realize that coyotes don't like foxes, and so coyotes had been killing foxes, and so when the coyote numbers dropped, fox numbers increased, and so foxes have benefited from the reintroduction of the wolf. And we're not really sure of what the downstream consequences that will be as the fox population increases, but certainly they have increased. Another effect, a negative effect, is that the wolf population has cut into the elk and moose population. And actually that was really the intended purpose of bringing back the wolf, was to decrease elk populations because they had been eating so much of the willows and aspens. So downstream consequences of that is that both aspen and willow populations are rebounding. We're seeing young aspens in places where we've never seen them before. Aspen stands are appearing where we haven't seen them before. So young aspens finally exist in the ecosystem where they haven't for 60, 70, 80 years. Now, benefiting from that are beaver. Beaver like aspen, and so they actually have a better food supply. They prefer aspen over conifers. They also like cottonwoods over conifers, so that's good for them. And beavers are damming more streams because there are more beavers. That's producing more wetlands, and benefiting from that are waterfowl largely. So again, these are literally downstream consequences of that. Also, it's thought that, this hasn't really been documented, but there have been more reports of otters in the park as well. So again, with increased wetlands, we have more otters. Also, that may be a consequence of having fewer coyotes, because coyotes will kill otters as well. The wolves also have been feeding on elk and moose carcasses, so they're killing a lot of elk and moose, and so there are more carcasses around, that's why that's green. And then benefiting from that has been the grizzly bear. So grizzlies have benefited from wolf reintroduction because they can steal carcasses in some cases from wolves. It really has to do with the size of the pack and so on. Sometimes wolves defend their carcasses, sometimes they don't. But generally speaking, grizzlies have benefited from this reintroduction. And then also probably black bears too. Black bear numbers have seem to be up as well, so they probably benefit from this as well. They can't steal the carcasses quite as easily as a grizzly, but they're benefiting as well. And then bison are slowly, we think, and I've got them in red, and this is maybe a little more hopeful at this point, but some of the wolf packs are beginning to turn to bison. So they're making significant impacts on the elk herd, and so they're beginning to turn to bison. And so we think they're going to have a negative impact on bison herds. There's one wolf pack, the Molly pack, which feeds exclusively on bison. We think there will be other packs like that. And again, hopefully downstream from that, this is more anticipated than real at this point, but we think that will help protect some of the lodgepole populations because, as we've discussed, bison will rub on lodgepole pines and kill those pines. So we think that will help in that issue. Now, also a couple of other management issues. When we look at Yellowstone ecosystem, really it's an island. It's an ecosystem that's isolated through development and agriculture around there. And one of the realities is that when you look at island ecosystems, the size of the ecosystem or the size of the island, if it's a true island, as the island gets smaller, genetic diversity decreases, species diversity decreases, and total biomass decreases as well. And so Part of this can occur in the national forests in terms of how those are managed. If you're going to do a lot of clear cutting that is going to isolate stands of trees, that's not really a great idea. And also, again, we just have this problem that the ecosystem itself is isolated from other places where we have grizzly bears, wolves, and so on. So part of the idea is to create corridors, animal corridors, so that they can move back and forth between these different islands. And some of these may or may not work. In other words, we may think it's a good idea to build a bridge over a road, but animals may not want to do that. They may not want to go over the bridge. So some of these ideas haven't really been tested out scientifically and don't hold up in terms of science. So again, we can have less developed corridors. There's no guarantee that animals will use those. And ideally what you do is, instead of having separate island ecosystems, is that you'll put them together and protect a larger habitat, and that's a better management strategy. So anyway, in terms of the Yellowstone ecosystem, there is a strategy to try to create corridors to the glacier area, Glacier National Park up in Montana. There are also some areas in Idaho that are wilderness areas, and they want to try to create these animal corridors. But the problem is that animals disperse. They don't read signs. They don't know where the corridors are, and there's no real strong evidence that that's going to work. But I guess it's worth a try in the meantime. And then another aspect of this in terms of forest management in the national forest, where trees are going to be harvested, is what we call edge effects. If you have a natural edge, you actually will have a greater species diversity than if you have a typical clear-cut straight edge. So one of the things that is being emphasized in the national forest when they do make clear cuts, and they still do make clear cuts in the forests around the Yellowstone ecosystem, is to try to duplicate these natural edges. And then last but not least, trying to recover damaged habitat. I talked previously about in the Yellowstone Park, or excuse me, in Grand Teton National Park, Moore Monroe, where some farmers had tried to make a go of it before. And so there's going to be an active effort to reestablish that back to a chaparral ecosystem. But also cattle management. Cattle are allowed to graze throughout the national forest in this ecosystem. Typically they overgraze. There's not much oversight here, so when they overgraze, they can damage the habitat as well. So there is a much bigger emphasis being placed on cattle management, making sure that you have the appropriate number of cattle per acre and not overloading that, so that there's better forage. And this is a management issue also, because where you have cattle, you're going to have the potential for interaction with grizzlies and wolves, and then that limits their distribution. So this is an ongoing legal battle, ethical battle within these managing agencies. So anyway, just a few other topics I wanted to be sure and get to in terms of the Yellowstone ecosystem.